I'm so excited to be here. And thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be with us. I'm thrilled to be here and just be part of this important series on supporting multilingual learners through bilingual education. So, as mentioned, I work for SEAL, which stands for Sobrato Early Academic Language. We are a nonprofit organization really dedicated to advancing the educational outcomes of multilingual learners and centralizing their needs and those of their families. Our mission is for all multilingual learners in California to learn, thrive, and lead. We strive to create a long-term systemic changes by addressing the needs of multilinguals at all levels, at the practice, research, policy, and advocacy. And most of our outward-facing work falls at the practice level, where we partner with districts to provide professional development for educators focused on pedagogy, collaboration, and alignment. And as mentioned, we also conduct research and publish insights around what works for English learner students and advocate for policies that centralize their needs. SEAL also supports the implementation of California's English Learner Roadmap, helping educators bring its vision to life in classrooms and across school communities. Now, the task I was given was to provide an overview of the history of bilingual education in California in 20 minutes or less. So, as you can imagine, condensing decades of work into such a short time can seem overwhelming. But SEAL is fortunate to have had Dr. Lori Olson as our founder, who has done a tremendous amount of work in gathering this information. For over 5 decades, she has worked on trying to build just schools for students as an educator, as a researcher, and as a champion advocate for multilingual learners. So much of the information I will be sharing today comes from a series of videos that can be found on our website. And I invite you to visit our YouTube channel and take the time to watch these videos in their entirety, as they provide a more detailed version of the history of bilingual education in California. And with that, I'll begin. So, as we all know, English learner education has always been deeply entangled in the broader political battles over immigration, over war, and shifting demographics. It's been a history that's included cultural and linguistic oppression, and it's also a story of resilience, marked by powerful movements of families, students, educators, and legal advocates fighting to transform schools into places our communities deserve. Since the beginning, this land that would become the United States was home to hundreds of indigenous languages. Later European immigrants who settled in the 13 colonies brought English, French, German, and other languages. And there was such a diversity of languages that when the US Constitution was being written, the founders debated, but ultimately decided not to declare an official language, knowing that in doing so, it would marginalize certain groups. And it wasn't until March 1st of this year, 238 years later, that English was declared as the official language of the United States. So pivotal events such as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Gold Rush continued to bring in people who spoke other languages. Some came willingly, and others had no choice. At the same time, the US officially ended Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, but replaced it with forced assimilation, where Native children were sent off to reservation boarding schools designed to erase their indigenous identity and language. And in response to this growing population, the federal, state, and local governments passed anti-Chinese and exclusionary laws, including bans on Chinese American children in public schools. And in 1855, California passed its first law requiring English-only instruction in schools. But Chinese parents fought back, and in 1859 petitioned to pen the first public schools that would allow Chinese students. So we can see how even in these early times, language had already begun to be intertwined with beliefs and policies of our educational system. Another historical piece that I want to highlight from the early years is the adoption of the 14th Amendment, because although it was passed to secure the rights of formerly enslaved people, it has played a significant role in the battles for equal rights that include rights over languages. Moving forward, then, much forward to the first half of the 20th century, we were about to enter World War I against Germany, which brought an intense anti German sentiment. In the Midwest, thriving German speaking communities saw their schools shut down, teachers jailed, and German banned in public. Speaking English became equated with being American, reinforcing the idea that English only was a patriotic and cultural norm. And this fueled major legal battles over language use in US schools. At the same time, science was on the rise with the notion that anything could be measured through science, including a person's intelligence. And so you can imagine that these IQ tests in English being used on students to sort and track them in school. Non-English speaking children were labeled as educationally handicapped, again reinforcing the idea that English proficiency equated to having a higher intelligence. Racial segregation was prevalent in schools, which meant fewer funding, resources, and poorer facilities for African American, Chinese American, and Spanish speaking Mexican American children. Efforts to challenge this inequality laid the groundwork for legal fights for educational equity. The Lemon Grove versus California, where Mexican American families refused to send their children to an inferior, segregated school, was the first successful lawsuit against school desegregation. The Montes versus Westminster is a landmark case in which Mexican American parents in Orange County challenged school segregation and won. And this led to the end of racial segregation in California schools. And this case helped lay the groundwork for the Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which the US Supreme Court declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. So the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s led to major legislation ending segregation and affirming equal education opportunity as a civil right. Schools became central to this effort, and bilingual programs emerged as tools to address inequity. In 1967, Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, providing federal funding for bilingual education to help overcome language barriers. That same year, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed Senate Bill 53, repealing a 95-year-old law requiring English-only instruction in California public schools. And by the late 1960s, the Chicano student movement staged walkouts across California demanding access to college preparation courses, an end to tracking and linguistic discrimination, calling instead for bilingual education and culturally relevant curriculum and staff. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Chinese American parents sued the school district, claiming that their children couldn't fully access their education because they were not receiving any support to understand English. And in 1974, the US Supreme Court ruled that schools must take steps to address language barriers. So this case led the foundation for what we now know as the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. It called for school districts to take affirmative action so that access is not denied due to language. And this case legally created a class of students called Limited English Proficient, later to be known as English learners. Following the Lau decision, the California legislature passed the Chacon-Moscone Bilingual Bicultural Act, requiring schools to offer bilingual education if there were 20 or more students in a grade that shared the same home language. In 1978, in Castañeda versus Picard case, made certain that guidance and instruction was based on sound educational theory, that it be implemented effectively with personnel and materials, and that it had to hold the test of time. The California Department of Education brought in key experts in the field, linguists and researchers who emphasized concepts like dual language development, comprehensible input, and language transfer. And Title VII and state funds were then used to design and develop models, making California a national leader in bilingual education throughout these years. However, in the 80s, as Dr. Lori Olson calls it, the perfect storm was brewing. We were in the midst of an economic recession, increasing immigration, refugee resettlement from Central America and Southeast Asia. And as a result, there were huge demographic changes and more languages throughout the state. Many in the English-speaking population saw themselves becoming less and less of a majority in the state, which led to a backlash and giving rise to another anti-immigrant and English-only sentiment. At the same time, the US government released the report, A Nation at Risk, stating that the quality of American education was declining. US students were performing worse than students in other countries and launched a wave of education reform calling for accountability, testing, and standards-based education. And once again, language became political. And this anti-immigrant, English-only sentiment fueled several anti-bilingual policies. Prop 187, an English-only initiative, passed by wide margins, but was struck down in the court for civil rights violations. And in 1998, a devastating blow, Prop 227, ended most bilingual education in California. It required that all public school instruction be conducted in English, limited the use of bilingual programs to only 1 year of sheltered English immersion. And parents who wanted bilingual education for their children had to apply for special waivers. But out of the ashes, organizations and advocates that had come together to try to defeat Proposition 227 formed Californians Together. It's a coalition designed to be an ongoing voice of advocacy for English learners in California. The National Reading Panel report came out in 2000, but did not take into consideration research on English learners. 2 years later, No Child Left Behind was signed into law, and that commissioned a $6 billion Reading First initiative that focused on English reading benchmarks for all and came with schools undergoing corrective action program improvement if levels were not met. All of this resulted in policies, testing, and instruction that focused only on English and created a narrowed approach to literacy where the importance of bilingualism and culture fell out of the equation, and rich language instruction was reduced to mastery of phonics in English as being what was most important for students to learn to read and be academically successful. But thankfully, educators, advocates, families who believed in bilingual education didn't give up. And many rebranded bilingual education and programs as dual language programs to avoid political pushback. They shifted the focus to asset-based models that emphasized equity and inclusion and were open to all students, English and non-English speakers, emphasizing enrichment over remediation. And it worked. These programs gained broad support. English-speaking families began enrolling their children, sparking rapid growth of dual language programs. But the success came with a cost. Traditional bilingual programs intentionally designed to support English learners were seen as outdated and remedial, even though both models share the same research base, goals, and commitment to biliteracy. So we entered the 21st century with this rebranding of bilingualism as a powerful asset. National research on the benefits of bilingualism was released, stating that bilingual programs work as well, if not better, than English-only programs. The new standards and frameworks supported the shift, and California became the first state to adopt the Seal of Biliteracy, celebrating students' fluency in 2 or more languages, and then again, increasing demand for dual language programs. So political and demographic changes also brought more bilingual leaders into power. So in 2016, 2/3 of California voters passed Prop 58, essentially repealing Prop 227 and encouraging multilingual programs for all students. It was sold to the majority of voters with the following arguments from ballot measure pamphlets. Research shows that students participating in programs taught in more than one language attain higher levels of academic achievement. Students proficient in English and a second language will be more employable, start out earning higher wages, and make California's workforce better prepared to compete for jobs in the global economy. And that proposition reforms allow schools to adopt the most up-to-date methods of language instruction to improve student outcomes and make better use of taxpayer dollars. And a year later, after the passing of Prop 58, California adopted the English Learner Roadmap policy, promoting biliteracy as a goal for everyone. So the national political ecosystem, English as the official language, targeted funding in jeopardy, the dismantling of OELA. This brings us to today, right? We've seen a resurgence of policies and rhetoric that mirror earlier efforts to suppress linguistic and cultural diversity. Bans on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and vigorous attacks on immigrant communities. And despite how dismal things may seem, there is hope. We now have decades of research that support the benefits of bilingual education. Longitudinal studies that show dual language models, especially one-way and two-way programs that are sustained through at least the end of elementary school, yield the most favorable long-term outcomes for English learners. We have research that clearly states the multiple benefits of bilingualism. And we live in a state that continues to uphold their commitment to educating multilingual learners through initiatives like Global California 2030, with the goal to increase the number of students who earn a state seal of biliteracy, increasing the number of dual language immersion schools, bilingual teacher preparation programs, and teacher authorizations, and increasing the number of world language classes available to students. Governor Newsom also issued a proclamation declaring June of this year as Immigrant Heritage Month in the state of California, which says a lot about the leadership and support we have at the state level. However, despite all of this, it's essential that we continue to advocate, educate, and support one another on this journey of bilingual education. Thank you.